All right, so we're still working on our discussion, Griffin's discussion of privacy and human rights, and we are in chapter 13 of this book on human rights, and this is 13D. So we've had a few videos before this, so let's do a little sum up now. As we've seen, Griffin has talked about privacy kind of in general, and also he's laid out a couple of different positions with respect to privacy. That is different, you could say, different intentions of the concept privacy. So not surprisingly, the different intentions of the concept will have corresponding different extensions. If intention extension throws you, remember intention is just a linguistic unpacking of a concept. The extension is the actual physical domain, the real world application of that concept. And how did he unpack this? Well, he talked about American jurisprudence. In other words, he looked at the practical side of human rights and privacy by looking at what have the courts said. And this is, all part of Griffin's general project. Remember, this turn towards a very practical dimension. You have the philosophical, theoretical, abstract structure of normativity, but you also have, in order to get to human rights, you got to go into the practical world, and they give the practical world, the practicalities give shape to the abstract notions of human rights that are ground out of the structure that he calls a normative agent. All right, so what does he get so far? After this survey of U.S. jurisprudence, so far, three basic forms of privacy and combinations of them. I'm not going to worry too much about the combinations, but what do we get? We get informational privacy, was basically, stuff that people can know about you, and he's unpacked that in terms of documents, artwork, diaries, etc., etc. Then we've seen the notion of a privacy of space. So this is a fairly kind of abstract zone, as the term suggests, information, kind of a cerebral type zone that you need that little space. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And also the privacy of space and life, which is more of a concrete one, like, the walls of your house, the personal space that you may happen to have like around you. So some people talk about a zone of privacy around you, and you kind of take it where you go. But when you think about this sort of little zone or personal space of privacy, it's been one thing when it's sort of like in your home, that kind of space, like within the walls of my home, there's the notion of privacy. And then when you take that and kind of pick it up and carry it with you, this sort of this conceptualized zone of privacy leads into this privacy of liberty. So when then I'm out on the streets, as I talked about earlier, you have kind of a personal zone that follows you around, that you're actually at the center of as you walk around doing your thing. And if you're not harming others or whatever, then you have the right, even in the public space, to be left alone, right? And that sometimes is referred to as this liberty of privacy, or privacy of liberty. Anyways, I don't think there's a definite agreed upon way to state it, but it's this notion that you have this kind of little, you're the center of this little zone that even goes out into the public space. So again, with this notion, you have to break from this one, which seems to be more of a kind of a colloquially understood sense of privacy, like the non-observable thing, as we talked about, two people kissing in public, right? There's a sort of a zone of privacy that protects them from non-interference, but not necessarily if you happen to look at them, you're not violating their human rights. But the violation of the rights in the zone of privacy in this one would be like if, the peeping Tom story. Well, then there is a violation there. So these two are related, but they're certainly not identical. And of course, we saw that so this is how the courts are treating all this. And in the privacy of liberty, there were two provisos. And so, stay out of my zone of liberty, my privacy of liberty, unless, right, non-interference, unless it's a matter of public interest. What makes it a matter of public interest? Well, if there's something going on in that zone that involves harm. And that would apply up here as well. You don't, just because you have this sort of privacy, doesn't mean you can do anything you want in that zone. It could be, the default is it's left alone, but it's not absolute. Why? Because if you're doing stuff harming others, you don't get to do that and be protected by privacy. And also in the courts, now philosophically we can debate this, but in the courts certainly have used a notion of community standards. Those have changed over time. But if you look, as Griffin does, courts have made judgments. They've made moral judgments. And so certain, consenting adult activities were regarded as okay according to the community standards, and other ones were not. So courts did weigh in and talk about community standards of morality, right? So heterosexual stuff was okay if it was between consenting adults, but if you step outside of that, even with consenting adults, that was ruled as illegal, right? Because homosexuality used to be regarded as illegal. So anyways, these things can change over time. Okay, so that's all part of legalities in the courts and the judgments they've made. The default is the right to be left alone, but it's not absolute. But otherwise, the default is that the liberty space is one of freedom, the right to be left alone. Okay, so after all this, Griffin says, what really is on solid ground here, right? Because he's just done a survey and tried to articulate it. He doesn't claim that the survey is complete, and he certainly is not claiming that he's added anything to the massive bulk of commentary on U.S. jurisprudence. He's just done basically kind of a cursory survey of sort of the highlights that he thinks are relevant to the discussion of privacy and human rights in his context, namely in terms of normativity. All right, so what's on solid ground? He says two things. Two things are on solid ground. He thinks that the right to informational privacy, way up here, this guy, so one of the forms, or you can think of privacy as a genus, like animal is a genus and dogs and elephants are species. So of the three species of privacy in the genus privacy, one species is informational, one is space life privacy, and another species is liberty privacy. He thinks that this species, informational privacy, that's got enough philosophical value and what to make it a human right. Now, remember, he doesn't think that it's, like this sort of lends weight to why these things are not absolute. Well, you can talk about, is it logically possible to be a normative agent? So on Griffin's theory, is it logically possible to have a conceptualization normative agent without including privacy? Yes. So logically speaking, the very notion of normativity does not necessarily include a concept of privacy. So that kind of weakens it, but it still has enough support. And it's also, but not full support, because it's not even empirically necessary because of the fact that, lots of people are exhibitionists and they're still fully functioning normative agents. It may not be the kind of normative agency instantiated in a life that I admire or want or what, but or could handle. Maybe I'm someone who I just couldn't handle. I couldn't function, but some people can. So empirically, it is the case that there's a percentage of the human population that can function as normative agents without this kind of informational privacy. I don't know, they can just keep going. So, but again, these really hard cases, or there's some people that, couldn't really function unless they had complete sort of protection. Neither of those are good ways to go. So we haven't unpacked exactly what the nature of the right will be, how it will be on the ground, because that's a practical one. But just the argument of getting it going for it to be a human right, it's got kind of a statistical importance. So we could say it's really important, we make it a human right, but it's not absolute, right? So it's got a high statistical importance because the bulk of the population would certainly need this kind of protection. How exactly that will look is a contingent matter, because community standards and things have to be factored in, and all kinds of things that maybe at one time, if people knew something about you, like you did something at the time was illegal, that could be extraordinarily damaging to your career, to your life, and as a normative agent. And then when things change, the community standards change, and so what was a huge deal at one time is like, so what later on? So the human right, the content of it, the actual the empirical sort of aspect of it, that can change over time. So what constitutes my right theoretically may not change, but on the ground, what the right will actually look like and protect me against could be very different. If everybody were totally cool with something going on now that now we don't like, but let's say in 15, 20 years, it just didn't matter. It might not really be something that you're protected against. You still have a right to informational privacy, but like if everybody's diaries were all over the internet, something like that, and then publishing diaries, nobody cared anymore, it might not be a big deal to publish a diary against someone's wishes, right? I mean, because no one cares, right? So it doesn't have an impact on anybody's normativity, not even the author of the diary. So that's why this thing of community standards can come in. That's why the right can still exist in an abstract form, but the shape of the right can change as the empirical circumstances change. Okay, so this is important. This statistical thing, all this stuff can change over time, but the right is still there, but the shape of it can change. So he thinks that's on solid ground. Yeah, there's a human right to informational privacy. So that species of privacy, not privacy the genus, not privacy per se, but if someone says, oh, privacy is a human right according to Griffin, I would say, well, you got to be careful. He means informational privacy, right? Not just privacy writ large. And we'll see why he doesn't. He's a little bit more skeptical of these guys down here, these species getting into the human rights category. Remember, because Griffin's always trying to put the brakes on everything becoming a human right. Okay, so but he thinks, yeah, the right to liberty, you bet, that's a human right, right? That's important. Narrow, broad sense, he hasn't really discussed that, but we're going to look more towards the narrow side of things. But so yes, there's a human right to liberty. So there's going to be something connected here, which we've seen that liberty and privacy are involved, at least in terms of the way that they're spoken about, right? That notion of the little space that follows you around, or that basically you're in the middle of, and it kind of comes up with you as you leave your house and you go driving around and you walk through a park, you have that sort of little space that you're in, right? That sort of liberty, privacy space, whatever you want to call it, this zone, he thinks, yeah, there's a human right there. But is it necessarily, should it be described using the term privacy? Is it really a species of privacy? That he's not so sure of, and he's going to point out some problems with that. And so on that note, we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into that precise relationship. What exactly are we talking about when we really talk about privacy and literacy? And I can't go into that right now because I've run out of board space. See you next video.